sort of developers right out of bed, and that's never a good thought. But then at the end of the day, it's been a long day, I'm sure, for many of you, full of interesting sessions, and we're sitting in front of cocktails and dinner. And so poor Sam and I are sort of your last sessions of the day. So we'll try to, at least for my part, try to get through things as quickly as possible. Particularly because I have 30 slides to get through in 20 minutes, which should be entertaining. So one of the things you may notice is that the talk title is different than you may have seen on the agenda leading up. The original purpose of the original title of the talk referred to open source and software as a service. That is a topic that I am very passionate about myself right now, something I talk about and write about a lot. If any of you have the interest in terms of talking about it with me later, I'll be at Sandy's Pub in about an hour and a half, whatever it is. So come find me. I'm happy to talk to you about that endlessly. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, really was building off of Jim's talk this morning in terms of sort of what we see from open source, what's coming down the pike, and just as importantly, what are the kinds of things we need to do in terms of continuing to move that ball forward. So Jim mentioned the new Kingmakers. This is something, if there's one audience in the world where I can present the slide and not have to explain it, I'm pretty sure it's this one. Everybody I'm sure knows where this comes from. Everybody I'm sure has read this 100 times. This is what we see. So for those of you who don't know what an analyst is and don't know what we do, basically I talk to developers, I talk to projects, I talk to foundations, I talk to companies. Every day, lots of them. And this is what we do sort of every day, all year. We go out and talk to the folks at conferences like this. So we see a lot of different things that are happening. Sort of a lot of different things that are going on. The way I explained it to an audience at FOSDEM, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, was basically if the folks at FOSDEM are out sort of fighting the individual battles on the ground, we're kind of the satellites that are orbiting the planet. So we miss some of the things that happen sort of day to day in the trenches, but we also see things that sort of happen all over the world, as it were. We see different patterns, we see different trends. And the thing that we always come back to is that things are changing. And things are changing, that's a sort of cliche in the technology industry today, but things are now changing fast, much faster than we've seen. So in other words, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the earth, etc. Things are so different than they used to be. And, the question that we always get is, how the hell did this happen? And the answer is very simple. As Jim said, I wrote this whole book on it. Anybody read it in the audience? Anybody read that book? I read a couple hands. For the rest of you, I don't have time in 20 minutes to go through the whole explanation. There are a lot of different things that have changed. There are a lot of different things that empower developers. We could talk about things like education. Jim, for example, spoke this morning about 60,000 people signing up for classes. That's a lot different than it used to be. In other words, when I was a developer coming up, if I wanted to take a course in something, I had to go justify to management who had to shell out a couple $1,000 and I had to be out of work for a week. That's a tough sell. These days, with courses from Linux Foundation or Coursera or wherever, you have the opportunity to educate yourself. You can, collaborate more effectively today than you could 10 years ago. We have, sort of properties like GitHub, which are massive centers of gravity. We have more formal structures than Linux Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, and so on. So whatever your needs, whether it's a couple people building a project, a side project, all the way up to something that's going to be commercialized and sold to vendors, you have all these sort of different tools. But the biggest single change, the biggest sort of single factor in terms of the rise of developers has been open source. I don't really think this is an arguable point. Because all of a sudden, for the first time, if I want to build anything, if I'm a developer, if I have an idea, I can just go do that. Right? I can find very high quality, freely available software that I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't need to go justify to my boss, hey, I need to buy a license for an operating system, hey, I need to buy a license for a database, and so on. I can just go do it. Right? So this changes everything. This is a change that all of you have lived, all of you have helped fuel. So, the difficulty is that when we look at this, for the first time in history, developers don't need permission from, the people that they used to have to ask, for access to these technologies, and that's great. And, we get into a world where it looks a little different than the businesses realize. So we tell the story all the time. It's funny. You go out and talk to sort of IT decision makers, CIOs, and so on, and they come back and they say things like, yeah, we don't use those technologies because we haven't issued them. Well, that's not really how things work anymore. Doesn't matter if you issued it or not, you have to be pretty good that developers are using your stuff. So this Venn diagram is something that we get a lot of questions about. we see pop up in slides from time to time. This is the world that we see. This is the world that we see every day. When you go out and talk to developers, what gets used is ultimately mostly what developers want to use. And, sort of that's a new world. That is part of the shift. But as Jim talked about this morning, there's a long way to go. Right? So a lot of people, will make the argument, I've made this, sort of in certain contexts myself, that open source is one. And in many respects it has. Most of the new development we see, going on, certainly from an infrastructure perspective, open source is any number of metrics that we can pick that speak to the fact that, essentially, this is, open source is the way the business is getting done. That being said, if you look around the landscape, the bulk of commercial sales, anyway, the overwhelming majority of them, are still closed source. We have one sort of very large entity in Red Hat, that has sort of made, essentially a large business, a $2 billion business, $2 billion revenue business at this point, on a pure play open source business. So there's a long way to go. So, to document this, and to describe some of the changes, I mentioned at the outset that things are changing and changing quickly. Well, what do I mean? Well, I was in front of all of you, or at least those of you here today who were also here for this event last year. I was here last year, and one of the things that we described, was these generations of attitudes towards software. All right, so the first generation is that software is essentially a means. And the example that we use for this typically is IBM. IBM founded in 1911. When their software business got going, early 50s, sort of pick a date, basically the software was just a means, right? It was not an end in and of itself. The end was the hardware. Anything that sweetened the pot, incented hardware sales, anything that got people to buy a physical good, awesome. Here you go. So this led to, what was not certainly called at the time open source, but led to proto-open source behaviors. In other words, you had users getting together with users and sharing customized versions of the operating system. It's very different, right? And people don't, people forget that this is where software came from. This is how things used to be. Now, the second generation came along and said, whoa, sort of, let's pump the brakes on that. There actually is money in this. And of course, the canonical example for this category is Microsoft, founded in 1975. So they got a deal in 80, 81 with IBM, ironically enough, that allowed them to sort of non-exclusively distribute software. So all of a sudden, Microsoft signs this deal, IBM goes out and pushes Microsoft software, sort of far and wide, but they don't have an exclusive. So Microsoft can turn around and sell this to anybody they want. And all of a sudden, it turns out the software is this good, this tangible good that can be sold. And Microsoft rises to sort of unprecedented heights from a technology perspective. Really, from a share price perspective, peaks around the turn of the century. And this defined the software market for years. Now, in the late 90s, right before that peak that I just mentioned, we have a sort of a new model that emerges that says, all right, I'm not going to try to out Microsoft, but I'm going to use software, specifically open source software, to build some other kind of business. So, the canonical example in this category is Google, founded in 1998. So they look at this and say software is differentiating. So if Chris DeBona or any of the Google folks are in the room, I will note for the record that Google has actually donated tons and tons of open source software over its lifespan. But historically, its infrastructure, its core infrastructure software was highly protected. Now, they kind of had one foot in, one foot out, right? Everybody probably knows the story of Hadoop, where Google doesn't make its open source, or does not make open source its internal MapReduce implementation, but they published 2 papers that make it possible for folks outside the company, Doug Cutting and others, to go implement the MapReduce algorithm and distributed file system that we sort of know as Hadoop. So it was not open source, because Google's behaviors at least suggested that they thought that this software was worth protecting. So you fast forward a couple years from there, and the example that we use in this category typically is Facebook. Could throw any number of different sort of web firms in this bucket. And historically, these companies behaved as if software was not differentiating at all, right? So yes, they had core pieces of software they protected, but by and large, things that they produced here, we're going to donate this as open source. So much so that the initial donations of this code, were kind of just chucked over the wall and forgotten about. It's just, hey, here's Cassandra, here's this sort of hybrid columnar database, go for it. And obviously, the companies have evolved since. I don't know if James is in the audience. Chris Aniszczyk, I think, is around somewhere, working for Twitter. So the companies got more sophisticated in their approach. But essentially, out of all these categories, right, kind of these, sort of software was just a means, software is the end, software is differentiating, so on. It's really the sort of last category, software is not differentiating, that we're focused on here. Right, because these are the folks that basically look at this and say, hey, this is a good model. Our model for developing software is collaborative, our model for developing software is open, and, these are smart people. They sat down and looked at the numbers, looked at the business case and said, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Let's do this. So, the question that we get, very, very frequently from, developers, from commercial organizations, open source projects, venture firms, and so on is, what does OSS need to do to take the next step? And I cannot tell you how gratified I was to hear Jim talk about issues, quote-unquote soft issues, and this is the sort of unfortunate thing. You hear these dismissed. Soft issues, such as sort of mutual respect, humility, inclusiveness, diversity. Because the simple fact of the matter is that we've done a remarkable job getting to where we are today, with, throttling ourselves effectively. By not embracing women, by not embracing people of color, other gender orientations, and so on. That is a problem. That is a problem that needs to be solved. I am hopeful, that, we're making progress. You see small signs of it here and there, but it cannot, and I stress this, it really cannot be emphasized enough. It was so good to hear that. Now, the interesting thing is that when you have this conversation, sort of, with, people, let's say from the more business side, sort of the Lord business side. I don't know if Mike's in the room. He was wondering how I was going to work the Lego movie in here. One of the things that we have, conversations about in open source, and this goes back a long way, right? You have a lot of people from the business side coming back and saying, this is just a bunch of hippy-dippy below. Like, what is this? We're trying to run a business here, and you want to talk about things like openness and, inclusion, respect and diversity, all these quote-unquote soft skills. And here's the thing, is that I can tell you, and I can walk through the case for you as to why this is important. I can build the case for you quantitatively. It's not a difficult case to build. Lord business in this case is just flat wrong, period. And the more important thing from my perspective is that, building on what Jim was talking about this morning, is it doesn't matter. In other words, you can basically set all of that aside. If you have somebody sort of within a company who's sort of irretrievably ignorant and just does not care about things like mutual respect, things like diversity and inclusiveness, you can build a case without any of that. Because when you sit down and look at the changes that we've seen in the market in just a year, it is remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable from what we've seen, because basically what we're talking about is the economic foundation for open source software is solid. And, this is the real change agent. This is the real, essentially, factor that's going to actually change behaviors. So in other words, we bring this up and people say,